Okay, so we are recording. Um, First of all, Miles, thank you for being here today, presenting us a webinar, our first webinar, international webinar on study group, and I can be more happy about it because I really like what you are teaching on ADI program. I always tell people that I feel very honored to be there, and it's a pleasure to have you here to talking directly to the other Brazilians that participate on our group. And you're going to present us a webinar that are going to try to respond a really interesting topic that what makes you a design analyst. And for you who doesn't know Miles, he's a professor emeritus in psychology at Wagner College. He has published on daseinsanálise and continental philosophy. Has specialized in daseinsanálise with adolescents and young adults. Miles, I don't know if you want to add something, but I think you can go from there. Please.
Bem, gostaria de agradecer ao Roberto pela oportunidade de falar com vocês hoje. Infelizmente, preciso falar em inglês, mas espero ser claro à medida que avançamos. Falarei com vocês hoje sobre daseinsanálise. Yeah?
Perfect.
Okay. Awful pronunciation, I'm sure, yeah. Okay. So from now on, I will speak in English. I guess I already said that. All right. It's a very wonderful opportunity to talk in this forum, and I hope it can be informal and at the same time informative. So I'll try to be in a medium way between lecturing and talking informally. The title of the webinar is a question. And so I thought about how to respond to this theme, this question. What does it mean to call oneself a Daseinanalyst? I think that's a fair translation of the title as it was presented. And so my strategy is to answer that question with some questions, first of all. And then towards the end, to present a few statements, assertions that might clarify what I've answered in posing my own questions. So I'm going to screen share the translations, if I can do that now. And I do a window or a screen? Screen?
Just a window.
Window, okay. Yeah. So now you can see it, yes? All right.
Yes.
Well, so here are my responses to the question Roberto raised, and there's a series of them that are basic, and then that there are some that more closely move to the theme that this webinar is all about. And I'll again try not to take up all of the time explaining things, assuming that most of you have some sense of what these ideas, notions mean. That is, have already the answers to these questions. But in case, especially at the very beginning, in case that's not so, it might be useful to answer these very basic questions at the beginning and then go more into the territory, closer into the territory that Roberto has asked me to cover. I think everyone here has a pretty clear answer to the first question, and yet I find that sometimes it's not so clear. And we have in this modality a source in the philosophy of Martin Heidegger, a number of concepts and terms, far too many to cover today, including what he, for example, calls the existentials, that is to say, the features or structures of the human kind of being. Now, there are all sorts of beings. There are inanimate beings, stones. There are somewhat animate beings, plants. There are animals, animate beings, cats and dogs. And if you're a believer, there is a God, which is a very special kind of being. These are all kinds of beings. And for most of us, this is what makes up the world in which we live, all of these beings. But among all of these beings, Heidegger picks out one kind of being, and that is the human being, as having priority and centrality among all of the other beings. Now notice he pushes God out of the way, as well as stones and plants and animals, to give priority to the human kind of being. Well, that human kind of being is Dasein. Right? So this becomes a technical term from the very beginning for Heidegger. In 1927, we'll soon have a century after that publication. And while it's become a technical term and therefore not translated, for example, like Gestalt, those of you who know Gestalt psychology, there's no good way to translate Gestalt into English. I don't know how it is in Portuguese to do that, but usually we retain the term Gestalt. And so we've retained this German term Dasein, leaving it untranslated. So the puzzle of it is pretty simple to solve. Essentially, it's just a name for the human kind of being. This makes us ontologically special, he says, in this world of all kinds of things, from inanimate to super animate or supernatural or transcendental beings, or a single being, depending upon the position that you take. So what's so special about this being, this human kind of being of Dasein? Why doesn't he begin with another kind of being as his starting point? And that is because, in his view, Dasein has an understanding of its being. That is, its Sein. That is, its way of being. It has an understanding of this way of being that's missing in every other kind of being. Stones don't have it. Animals, plants, well, we have the question, do animals perhaps have some sort of understanding of their being? Until they can tell us in a natural language, we have to be agnostic about that. And in the case of God as a as a being doesn't need to, right? There's no question about the self-understanding of God. So that leaves us with the human kind of being who has a special understanding, and it's given. So the question, what is Dasein for our purposes here, can be easily answered. It's that unique kind of being among all of the beings that we recognize and have organized in various ways, animate, inanimate, etc. And it's, of course, common to each of us. Now, everyone here is a different embodied being. But what we have in common, says Heidegger, is something that in a strange sort of way even presupposes our being embodied, although obviously we can't be without it. That is to say, we require this body. But on the other hand, Dasein is not your body or my body, as we sit here in various places in the world. What we share, however, is this understanding of ourselves. Each of us has this self-understanding of his or her being. That is to say, his or her Dasein. And this we have all in common. Let's not spend too much more time with that, but let me try to apply it immediately to why we're here. What this means in terms of therapy is that the starting point for an analysis of Dasein, that is Daseinanalysis, begins with two instances of Dasein that have been actualized, realized, as you with a certain name, as me with a certain name. I'm speaking to each of you individually. So compared to other forms of therapy, right, which may begin with the idea of a counselor and a client, of physician and a patient, Dasein analysis, as it has been worked out, takes this very different perspective. And that is, before any consideration of he, she, whatever role is being played, whatever expertise might be granted or assumed for anyone, whatever reason might be given for the analyst or the analysand to be there, is the Dasein of each of the two partners who sit down with each other. And in the case of Dasein analysis, one takes a resting position stretched out, and the other takes a position in a chair next to the analysand. So as you can see, there's quite a lot to unpack and to have unpacked in this notion of Dasein. But its relevance for the theme here, what makes a Dasein analyst, I think in a sense has already been answered, right? But there's much more to ask. What has been answered by just looking at this notion of Dasein is the very special way in which the Dasein analyst understands and conceives of the relation between the analyst and the analysand. And it is one of an immediate, unmediated Dasein to Dasein. Easy. It seems quite easy, but it's very difficult in a sense to get beyond, because we look, when we meet somebody coming in for the first time, we see another body, we see a female or a male, we see a tall, a short, a young, an old. We see a very specific mixture of physical characteristics only. And as we talk, we hear about a very different sort of experience, obviously. But before any of that can be taken into consideration, that is to say, before any of that becomes therapeutically valuable and important, is this consideration that in order to see the other as male or female, tall or short, young or old, etc., we must have this relation of Dasein to Dasein already in play. Similarly, we can move outside of the Dasein analytic situation and realize that the same thing happens every day, all the time, in our meetings with people, but also our encounters with trees and with animals and with other beings might be important to us. Let me go to the second question, and then maybe we can pause and see if we want to move to a less formal presentation. See, it's quite a lot in that first question. Second question simply addresses the second half of the word Daseinanalysis. So now we know what we were talking about with the first half. The second half, what is analysis? As you all know, Daseinanalysis had its origins in psychoanalysis, right? And with particularly the Swiss Medard Boss, Swiss psychiatrist and psychoanalyst. Though you're familiar with psychoanalysis, you may not know that the notion of analysis in psychoanalysis is a somewhat derived notion, which has been returned to its original sense, the Greek origin of this verb to analyze, analyön. It's quite different from the Freudian psychoanalytic notion. For Freud, to analyze, analysis is to take apart, the way you might in a chemistry lab take apart a compound to its elements. No, in Daseinanalysis, on the other hand, by contrast, the more original and basic meaning of the word analyön, of analyze, is to set free. So if you go looking in your lexicons of Greek terms, you'll see that the primary sense of analysis, and the one that's recovered here in Daseinanalysis, is not a taking apart, as again Freud had thought was the way to go, but rather a setting free of Dasein, as it turns out, from its having been moored or lashed tight to a particular place. We take a little boat, a ship, a sailing, and we tie it up, as they say. We moor it so that it doesn't float away. This is the sense of analysis in Daseinanalysis, that is to undo that mooring. What we find in the person who comes to see us is that there's some sense of not being able to move about freely, using this image of a boat, not being able to move freely with the wind on the water, freely to move about, but some sense having been tied down, tied up. The answer to the third question then is already at hand. Daseinanalysis is the freeing up of Dasein, right? The unmooring, if you will, the helping to set free the Dasein of the analysand. The fourth question then, and we'll stop at this point and see how we want to proceed. Daseinanalyst, very simply, and perhaps this is all that's asked for by Roberto, the Daseinanalyst is a human being, one of the unique sorts of being in the world, who for some strange reason probably a number of them, and we'll come to that later on in this presentation, finds it welcoming, engaging, and interesting, and in case after case, instance after instance, to be somebody with another Dasein who makes it possible, if he or she can, as a Daseinanalyst, to make that setting free occur. Not because I say so as the analyst, but given that the analyst end does this of her own, of his own. The fourth question then, asks us about a certain kind of person, a certain kind of human being, obviously, who's interested in this and who finds this of interest as something to do as part of his or her life. And obviously, we're not Daseinanalysts all day long. We're only Daseinanalysts when we are in this unique situation, which is the Daseinanalytic situation. But as to why we're here today, probably the same answer could be given to that question as to this question, what is a Daseinanalyst? There's something that we all have in common here today, and that is an interest in being in a partnership with someone that allows for this freeing up of the other to come to pass on his or her own terms, in his or her own good time. So let me stop there, and I'll move that away. We'll come back to it, if I can do that. And see if there's some questions. Yeah,
stop sharing.
Easy enough to say, Rebecca, for me to find it. There was another one. Okay, there we go. Got it. Okay.
So I will shut your microphone because of the echo. And if there's any questions, I can present. Oh, shoot yourself. Okay. Very good presentation, Miles, so far. And I don't know if anyone has a question. If you want to add something. Okay. Nobody wants to add anything, but there's a thing that comes to my mind, Miles. Dasein doesn't need a gender, she or he, or this kind of discussions. Here in Brazil, people tend to, try to find answers for these questions. I don't know if somehow or sometime this pass over your mind, or if it's interesting. There's an interest or international interest in to ask for a gender of the Dasein.
Yes, this came up in a recent International Federation of Daseinanalysts meeting last week. And there we have a representation of people from all over the world, in Greece, in Austria, I believe also from Brazil, and from the States. And it was a question, I think I can mention her name. Some of you may know her, Maria Corre. She is in Athens, and she's a good friend and a colleague and an experienced Daseinanalyst. And so the question, just as Roberto asked, it came up. Well, doesn't the gender of the analyst make a difference? Doesn't being, let us say, someone comes who is a young woman of 25 for analysis, doesn't it make a difference if she is met by Maria Corre, who is perhaps is a bit older than she is, but a woman, or is met with Roberto, who is a young man, roughly of the same age, or with Miles, who is quite a bit older. It could be her grandfather, if not her father, but is male. And is there some relevance to this gender role that we all play and have learned to play in socialization in slightly different ways, by the way, in different cultures? And we both chimed in at the same time. No, it makes no difference. And so I wanted to comment more, and Maria wanted to comment more. And what came into the discussion, and maybe this will get more to Roberto's point, is that this again misses the notion of what Dasein is, right? Dasein is the possibility, if you will, the potentiality for any kind of gendered interaction. Were there not this general being human, there would be no possibility for being male human, or being female human, or being old human, or being young human, right? Tall human, short human. And so we were both concerned to remind everybody that it's so easy to immediately make an equivalence between Dasein and, let's say, the way I like to usually characterize it, as a named actualization of Dasein, as Roberto Cruz, as Miles Groth, as Pedro Munoz, Marcos Nascimento, and so on. A named actualization of Dasein. This led back to the question, well, what about those months and years when a human being doesn't know it's a male or female yet? And it's quite clear, as we know from developmental psychology, that there's a period of time before individuals get it that there are different sexes, and yet they live and interact with each other and with their parents. If you take the Freudian perspective, it may be around age 3. It might be a little bit older, maybe a little bit sooner, but not likely much earlier than age 3, when it dawns on the individual that there's the so-called difference between the sexes, right, which Freud had made so much of. But it seems clear enough that the ability to interact of a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old who doesn't know he's a boy, or she doesn't know that she's a girl, is perfectly feasible, and it goes on quite well. We don't have to go so far as Freud did and say, there is this identification that takes place then between the little girl and her mother, and she realizes that this is a female identification, and the same thing in the case of the boy. We don't have to go that far, but we can learn from the example of the 2-year-old and 3-year-old who doesn't yet know that it's a boy or a girl, right? That there's a capacity for the relationship between Dasein and Dasein. Does that mean that in the analytic situation, it's as though we have 2 3-year-olds sitting together? Well, in a certain sense, maybe it does, right? And maybe even younger. On the other hand, obviously, these features of gender, of sex, those are 2 different things, of course. And then all of the other characteristics that I mentioned, linguistic, so-called racial, age-specific, role specific, how the person identifies, right? As analyst and analyst, and in particular for our purposes, then these come into view. So in any case, Maria and I agreed, and both of us were able to contribute a little bit to that clarification with this understanding that it is very much like the experience of the 2-year-old or the 3-year-old, right, who doesn't know it's a boy or a girl and doesn't really care. There are other little ones running around, and then there are bigger ones who are looking after the little ones running around. So I don't know if that takes any measure of your question, Roberto, but that's how recently the very same question came up and how we responded to it.
Sure, Miles. I will shut up your microphone. Yeah. Okay. The two questions. Gustavo has asked Maria's surname. I think that he need to enlighten.
Korre, Korre. She's president, I believe, of the Hellenic Daseinanalytic Institute in Athens.
Okay.
Maria Korre, Korre.
And I don't want to take too much time of your presentation, but there's another question that came to my mind, that if Dasein analyst is supposed to set free the Dasein, that's why you have to pass to training analysis, because you have to bear your own freedom. That's why you have to pass on the train analysis to become a daseinsanalist.
Well, I think, and then I was misunderstood, because the analyst doesn't set free the analyst, and the analyst makes a situation possible in which the analyst and can be freer, yeah? So it's not possible for me to somehow get inside the other and do something that will force the individual or enable the individual or allow the individual to become to be set free, to be free. But I can, as an analyst, make the conditions, and we can talk about that more, optimal for the analysand to do that. And for this, we have to get out of the way, right, and let the analysand do that. But as to how to set those conditions best, there's a lot to say about that. And to the second part of your question, it is precisely the so-called teaching analysis, the layer analysis, that is, maybe you can give it in the Portuguese. What is teaching analysis and training analysis?
Yeah, análise e treinamento.
So the importance of that, right, is to understand what that experience of freeing up is like. So everyone who is a Dasein analyst has been through this process, right? He or she may not have needed it, that is to say, may have felt quite liberated and free to go about realizing his or her possibilities. But even someone who's maximally free in this sense can experience in the teaching analysis and training analysis, at least in a few instances, how that feels, right? And how it has been made possible thanks to the analyst. So that's the importance of it. Why not just read about it? Why not just read case histories of individuals, right, who have experienced this? I like to compare this to swimming, right? And to the experience of being on the couch. I can read lots and lots of books about swimming, but until I jump into the water and start moving my arms and legs around, I don't know what swimming is. And I would say that this is precisely analogous to what happens in a training analysis, right? There you experience, you realize this uh, um, transformation, this freeing up, which is ultimately the goal. Just as you realize what swimming is like after you've flapped about in the water for a while and gradually get over your fear of being in the water. It's not such a bad analogy, is it, after all? Because the analysand in Dasein analysis is also a little bit afraid of just what's going to happen here when I jump in the water, if I can extend the metaphor. It's going to happen to me. Am I going to sink or swim? What's it like to be in water and not in the air, right, and on the ground? Well, I won't take the image too far, but so I hope that will respond a bit to what you asked. And yeah, the design analyst doesn't do anything, and I can put that in better terms later on. But what is important is, in a sense, not doing what must be done by the analysand. That's what's key. And in fact, to make this distinction between two kinds of caring about the other that's made by Dasein analysts, the kind that's interventional, precisely takes away from the analysand the opportunity to do it on her own, to do it on his own. On the other hand, there's what has been called waymaking, caring about the other, and that's what happens in Dasein analysis. The former was characteristic of psychoanalysis, right? Where the psychoanalyst made interpretations, reconstructions of the past. Analysis was analysis of transference and resistance and of defense mechanisms. There's none of that in Dasein analysis. There are no interpretations given. There are no reconstructions of the past history of the person made, right? Sure, I might have a pretty good history of the person, a sense of what their life was like, and the person may talk a lot about what their life has been up to that point. But that's not what's at stake, right? And we can also talk about just how one's past is understood phenomenologically in a very different way, what it is to remember, to recall, and how different it is differently understood phenomenologically than it is in terms of the natural science view that Freud held.
Sure, Miles. I think we can continue on your presentation. I don't know if you want to take a pause or anything like this, but there's a.
Okay, I'll go back to that screen share. I did it once before. Now let's see if I can do it again.
Right after the smiley face, presenting now. Just a window.
Can you share your copy? Why don't you do that?
Sure.
So we don't waste time while I learn how to operate a computer.
You can proceed in your presentation and I can share.
Is it there now? Okay. So we're at the fifth question after a little break there, a little gap after the first four. Are there different kinds of Dasein analysis? This is a question that has come up. And if you look at a current reference book of about 5 years ago or 6 years ago, and it's a bit of a classic, it's known all over the place. There we are. Okay. This is the fifth one, the fifth question down. If you look at a handbook such as the Wiley Handbook of Existential Therapy, you can read an article, you can read 3 articles about Dasein analysis. And there you would read that there are 3 kinds of Dasein analysis, and they have different names. One is called short-term, one is called relational, and one is called orthodox. Well, I've written a review of this part of the handbook. Actually, the handbook is huge, but just this part on Dasein analysis. And I think it's important to remember that there is only one kind of Dasein analysis, right? And so I'm just cautioning anybody, if you do go looking in a source such as the Wiley Handbook, and this is quite a prestigious, highly regarded book, that I believe it's misleading, right? Take just the 2 that I mentioned that are there in addition to orthodox, so-called relational or short-term Dasein analysis. The idea that Dasein analysis should be long or short, that it can be assessed in terms of how many sessions have gone by, I believe is a mistake and was never intended by the founders of Dasein analysis. Dasein analysis may be short in terms of sessions, 10, 12, maybe fewer, or it may be long. This is determined by the analysand. This is determined by the, if you will, natural history of the analysis. So I think it's somewhat misleading to say that you could shorten something that doesn't have a length, right? You can't shorten something that isn't short or long. The other is this notion of relational Dasein analysis. And this seems to be a pleonasm. This seems to be something that is rather redundant and misleading, because every Dasein analysis is a partnership. It is a relation. And what has happened in this case is to try to connect it to so-called relational modes of therapy and make it at home there. I think that if we have an idea of what Dasein analysis is and what makes for a Dasein analyst by the end of this webinar, we'll have, and perhaps they already have, an understanding of Dasein analysis as one mode, right, and not several. So it's enough for that question, right? And maybe that's perhaps too much of a discussion. But since it's out there and representations are given of several kinds, I would suggest, from my point of view, that that is misleading, that there is, in fact, just the Dasein analysis that we understand and have understood since the 1960s, and when things were formalized by 1970. So we're more than a half century beyond this. And okay, we'll go to the next question then. How does a Dasein analyst work? And this question came in this order of the questions that I thought might be worth raising. How does a Dasein analyst work? Because of Roberto's question about what is it that characterizes somebody who is working as a Dasein analyst and not, let's say, as a psychoanalyst or a Gestalt therapist or a therapist of an existential analysis modality, of which there are many, 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 especially in the United Kingdom, right? Quite a few. And by this question, how does a Dasein analyst work? I wanted to frame the identity, right? This question of identity as a Dasein analyst that Roberto raised in context of the whole life of the individual who's working as a Dasein analyst, and not just talk about technique, because in a sense there is no technique for Dasein analysis, right? There is no metapsychology. There's no handbook. There's no manual for conducting Dasein analysis. To say then how a Dasein analyst works is to ask, how is this different from everything else that the individual, he or she, does during the day? Perhaps teaches, perhaps writes, perhaps has a personal life and as a public life. But when it comes to this time, these hours, perhaps 1 hour or two in a day, perhaps several hours in a day, several days of the week, I think what I would point out here is that it is a very, very unique situation, this partnership, the setting in which things occur. And here I put the question at this point because it brings up the very touchy issue that a lot of people still have difficulty with, and that is the use of the the couch or the recliner. And maybe what is a good Portuguese word for chaise longue or recliner today rather than couch?
Divan.
So why is this important, right? This is what this question wants to address. And here I think I can spend a little bit of time, and then we get to the end of the first hour, and perhaps we might break briefly or go on. It's up to you all. The idea that Dasein analysis can take place face to face, I think, is a mistake. So if you're going to call yourself a Dasein analyst and you're working with individuals face to face, one chair facing another chair, you're not doing Dasein analysis. One of the major, what I've learned, what we've learned from psychoanalysis and why it originated, Dasein analysis originated in psychoanalysis, was that there was some special environment, atmosphere, attunement between individuals that occur when they're in the same physical space and yet not facing each other eye to eye. Freud's reasons for doing this, we have different stories, right, about how it originated. One is that one of his analysans had back problems and asked if she could put her feet up because that helped relieve the pain. And she even said, "I'll buy you a Victorian daybed." And this is what was bought, and it's still there in London in the Freud Museum that Freud was given, and filled up with cushions and blankets and rugs and all kinds of warm things for the person to rest on. The other thing that he is quoted to have said, and these are at very different times. That one was early on. Later, he said, I was really finding it really difficult I was finding it difficult for people to stare at me all day long. And he would see 7 or 8 people a day, 6 days a week. I don't think that was really honest on his part. One of the reasons he probably said that was as he was getting older in the last 12 years of his life, he was quite ill and he looked awful. He had cancer of the jaw. And he, I think, as anybody would who had a prosthetic jaw and a misshapen face, felt uncomfortable about being looked at. So there's something of a cynical reaction there, which I think we can also dismiss. What really it amounts to, and this is what Medard Boss picked up on, who had been on Freud's couch, by the way, in his early 20s for a small number of psychoanalytic sessions, was that when you are in a situation in the same physical space as someone else, and yet not eye to eye, and able to watch all of the expressions that the eyes and the body movements provide as clues, you're in a world that's entirely acoustic. You're in a world that's entirely auditory. And what is possible then in that world is a higher focus, a more general focus on what's spoken, and not how it looks coming out of the mouth of the person, not how it's accompanied by gestures. And most analysans will move about as they're in the kind of soliloquy. But more important, it puts the emphasis entirely on what is said, and secondly, allows for silences that would be intolerable if you were face to face. So in a Daseinanalytic situation, I'm out of view of the analysand, she's out of view of me. There may be a minute or two, sometimes longer, with nothing said by the analysand. If we were facing each other, that would be intolerable, right? Socially, when we are having conversation like this, if we were to simply pause to reflect, right? Or because we were inhibited or for whatever reason, and yet we're face to face with the person, we would be soon very uncomfortable and need to say something, right? Or there would be a need on the part of the analyst to say something, whether it's, why are you silent? Or where are you now? Or so being out of view, what was brilliant about Freud's use of the couch, what was brilliant about it, and that Dasein analysis, in a sense, developed further, was this focus on the spoken word as produced by the analysand, allowing for long, long periods of silence, right, in which the analysand can mull over, can reconsider, can fantasize, can think nothing, can simply relax for a little while, and then regroup and begin again. Something comes to mind, there we are, we follow it. This could be sabotaged if we're face to face and need to say something. The analyst then doesn't, from the point of view of the analyst, doesn't need to say anything. We wait, and she will say something, right? Or she'll say, I think I want to go home. I'm finished here. That's fine too, right? And it's in the hands of the analyst, and that's the central focus. So this is how the Daseinanalyst works. He or she works in this situation, this setting, in which the other is relaxed in a position that's not quite lying down as though to sleep, and not sitting up and not standing, not sitting on the floor, but in a sort of median position, halfway between, and Medard Boss will write about this, halfway between waking and dreaming. So you're in this dreaming world and waking world. So you're in this position, which is not a sleeping position, and it's not an alert sitting up position, as we usually meet each other standing or sitting. So it is unique in being, as it were, a middle ground between, or better yet, a ground that includes both elements of waking life and dreaming life. This is how the answer to the question how the analyst works is, I think, best answered by looking at the situation in which the analyst works. So, Roberto, do we want to take a brief pause at the top of the hour here and just come back in 4 minutes, or do you want to keep on forging ahead? Or do you want to have some questions?
It's up to you, Miles. We don't usually have a pause, but if you want it.
Let's just take a 4-minute pause, and we'll come back, and it's just a little bit at 11 now, and just in 3-4 minutes, 5 minutes, somebody may want to get something to drink and move about a bit. It's okay, so we'll come back.
Gonna translate for Portuguese.
Ok.
O Miles, ele falou pra gente tirar uma pausinha de 5 minutinhos, que é o hábito da ADI, pra gente tomar uma água no banheiro, fazer uma coisa e já retornamos, ok? was trying to translate the text.
What did you, I missed the first part.
I was trying to translate the text that you have sent me. Just as you were showing Portuguese.
Okay.
Miles.
Hey, Pedro.
Hi, hello. I have a question, but I don't know if have a place now. Are there some factical difference between the science analysis from Binswanger and from Boss?
Yeah, I can start with that actually. When everybody gets back, then maybe that would be a good thing to do, since most people know about Binswanger as well as Boss. So I'll start with that.
Well,
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm not sure about Pedro Desiderio, but Munoz, I know that you can make questions directly to Miles, so feel free to do that.
Is everybody back? I can't see.
Yeah, people are joining. Marcus is in.
Yes, here's April. Pedro asked about the concept of flesh. And while Miles was talking, I was thinking about yoga practice. I believe that there is a question there about daseinsanálise and body. So my question is what is flesh in Portuguese? You know, what the word flesh in Portuguese is, or if is there another similar word?
So you can make a distinction between the body and being embodied. The fact of having a body, right, which each of us can attest to, is different from being a body, that is to say, being embodied. And it's the second one that's of interest to Daseinanalysis and Daseinanalysts. So, for example, physical proximity of two bodies, let's say any two of you, right, who might be in the same room together, doesn't necessarily mean that the two of you are close in the sense of being embodied. In fact, let me give you a more vivid example. If you get on a subway train, a crowded subway train, for example, and you're very, very up against 2, 3, 4 other bodies practically touching them. In terms of your being embodied, of course, you're far, far away. Otherwise, you couldn't tolerate the ride. Yeah. Another example would be someone you're very, very close to in this sense is in another country on a vacation or a visit, or has gone home for some reason or emergency. And yet, in terms of the embodiedness, which is an existential, you're in fact nearer to that person, closer to that person, because you're so close, as we say, intimate with that person. That person means so much to you that they are in fact nearer to you than, let's say, some person who's sitting in the room next to you. So the difference between having a body and being a body, I think, is in the question that you raised, Marcos. And it's this being a body that's of interest, right, to the Dasein analyst and the experience of the individual. I'm going to just take, we can come back to that. I just didn't want to leave Pedro's question that was raised just after the break unanswered, and then we can return to that too, because it's an important question. This question of being embodied as an existential in Dasein analysis. Well, Pedro Munoz's question was, you know, there's not only Medard Boss here to think about, but also the person who is responsible for first thinking about Dasein analysis in the context of the care of individuals. And that was Ludwig Binswanger, who was also Swiss, was a friend of Heidegger's, by the way. They went to grade school together, and who wrote extensively about Dasein analysis. Now, he didn't coin the term. A friend of his, Jakob Wirsch, coined the term and said, "Hey, Ludwig, this might be a good name to give to what you're doing. Daseinsanalysis. It's not psychoanalysis, it's Daseinsanalysis." And Binswanger adopted that suggestion from his colleague Jakob Wirsch, and that's where we got the term. So it's modeled on psychoanalysis, as I said at the beginning. Well, here's the difference between the two, though, and to get closer to that. Binswanger was not, he was a psychiatrist, as was Boss, right? Both medical doctors and psychiatrists. But Binswanger never practiced in the setting that Boss did, and that is in the privacy of the residence of the analyst. Binswanger was a hospital psychiatrist. Now, it was an elite hospital, right? It was a hospital for the rich and famous in Switzerland. Excuse me. It was not a general hospital, but it was one in which individuals such as Nijinsky, the dancer, one of the relatives of the British royal family, went to live for a period of time in very luxurious circumstances, by the way. So this was not a madhouse, not an insane asylum of the kind that you could find in Italy, Switzerland, Austria, Britain, US, everywhere. What his effort was about was to create what he called an anthropology that could be used by psychiatrists, medical doctors in institutional settings to understand what was going on in the life of the individual, to understand the psychopathology, here borrowing from Freud this notion of something that can go wrong with the psyche, just as there can be a pathology of the body, right? The pathology that medical students study. Binswanger attempt to understand and to put in anthropological terms, philosophical anthropological terms, and in terms of psychopathology, the names we give to so-called mental illnesses. That was his task. And ultimately, to put it very briefly, he said each Dasein, but in fact, he was thinking more of each man or woman, right? And this is where things went afoul with Heidegger, and they agreed that he had misunderstood, by the way. That this attempt on the part of the person to create a world project had gone off the rails. That is to say, unlike most of us, the world project, as Binswanger called it, of certain individuals is misshapen, is distorted, is so different from the typical average cultural so-called normal project of a life, right? That the person was deemed to be psychotic, or in some cases simply neurotic, having trouble doing that. Well, this is very different from what Boss determined later. And that we can put in a couple of terms briefly. It was not Boss's interest to understand the other. In fact, Boss would say, it's impossible to understand another. And so this effort to do so, which was Binswanger's effort, was misled, right? Second difference was, and I think we can call Binswanger a psychiatric Daseinanalyst, and we can call Boss a therapeutic Daseinanalyst. Binswanger's major concern was understanding in theoretical terms, which again, Boss thinks is not possible, people who were in distress. Boss was simply interested in what can I do with this person, for this person. And now he did work in hospitals. He worked in psychiatric hospitals, and the famous Olicon seminar started with a lecture by Heidegger at Kreuzlingen. And so he continued there, and then eventually, and had been many, many years in hospital psychiatry, right? But then put that aside and devoted his time to writing, to conferences, but to seeing individuals on the one-to-one basis in his home, where I met him, actually, in the Zolikon, where the Zolikon seminars had taken place. So those differences, I think, are important. Their goals were different, and their understanding of Dasein was different. Boss ultimately would say Binswanger confused the ontic with the ontological. He never really was looking at Dasein, but he was looking at this particular human being, or that particular, he was looking at in the traditional sense, right, a man or a woman, a Swiss or an Austrian or a Chilean, Brazilian, American. So that's the short version of it. And I think it's most important as to what the difference in their goal was, right? Binswanger to understand, Boss not to understand what's not understandable after all, but rather to find a way to make it possible for the person to proceed with this freeing up of his or her existence, right? His or her Dasein. So there's to Pedro's question, and perhaps something of what Marcos asked about embodiment and the difference that perhaps we can say something more about that as we go along here.
Sure.
Okay, let me then go to this next question. Como alguém se prepara para ser daseinanalista? How does one prepare to be a Daseinanalyst? There's a tradition now that was established in 1970 and that continues on now for more than 50 years of institutes. There are several institutes. At this point, I think about 6. And there are, in some places, more than one institute. I believe there are 2 institutes in Brazil, 2 in Greece. There were 2 in Switzerland. There, in most other countries, there are 1. So to prepare to be a Daseinanalyst, I think you could use as an example our program, the American Daseinsanalytic Institute. And essentially it consists of, and here I can be really brief because you can just go and look at the website, and there's nothing special here to teach or say, but it's a program in which individuals generally with a fairly extensive background already in some form of providing therapy for people, either a psychiatrist, clinical psychologist, social worker, counselor, people from very many different backgrounds, college and university counseling, come to us. And then they have the experience of looking at theoretical issues in classes, and we've done classes online since 2021. Classes were mostly in person, of course, until the era of the computer and Zoom and that sort of thing. But theoretical discussions, reading, particularly of Heidegger, but also of Freud, who's very important, and then those who represent the tradition, Boss, of therapeutic Daseinanalysis, Medard Boss, Jean Condrau, Alois Hicklin, and quite a few others, right down to some things that have been published in the last couple of years, in the last 10 years or so, that Roberto mentioned at the beginning. I'm happy to have done a couple of books on this, and also to have translated, reissued a translation of Jean Condrau's Heidegger's Impact on Psychotherapy. So these are now helpful and basic texts. This is, I think, for most people, realistically, in the early part of the 21st century, a part-time endeavor. None of the people who are in institutes anywhere, as far as I know, are just in the institute. And I don't think that this is so much different from what was the case in psychoanalysis. People who were in psychoanalytic training were doing other things. They were teaching, they were doing therapy of other sorts while they were learning about psychoanalysis. So it is here. You are in on a part-time basis with a cohort of people who are studying online together in seminars like this. And then the all-important teaching analysis begins, right? How long, and this leads up then to supervision of what the individual's currently doing with in whatever setting he or she may be working. That's the third component. So there are teachers, there are those who are doing the training analysis, and those who are doing supervision. For our program, just to be very brief, it probably extends, since it's part-time, over 5 to 6 years. And it includes a maximum of 200 hours of personal analysis, of training analysis, which is so essentially core of the experience. Also attendance at courses that have been ongoing now for 4 years. It involves monthly, perhaps more frequent supervision, and ultimately what it will amount to is a control analysis, as it's called, and that is where one of the candidates will take a Daseinanalytic therapeutic experience with somebody for study, and perhaps even write about it and eventually present it. There are examinations along the way, they're brief, they're oral, and we hope that by the end, when the person has finished this program of preparation, I don't like training, I like this word preparation better, and I see it's in the Portuguese preparado, to have something to be able to put into writing and present as a paper, as a formal paper, or is a presentation of this kind. So that's how you prepare. That's how one prepares to be a Daseinanalyst formally. How does it take place existentially, however, right? How do I get ready to do this? Well, I think the next question then, so we were away from the formalities here, everything that you can read about in terms of programs here or in Greece or in Brazil, wherever. The next question becomes even more important, right? And that is, how does one know one should become a Daseinanalyst and therefore do all of this, right? And take all of this time. So let me tell you about my experience. And it can't be repeated now because it happened so many years ago and in a very different context. The world is different. And then you can infer, come to your own conclusions about how you would know if you should become a Daseinanalyst. So give me 5 minutes to just tell you a little bit about my own experience and then see if this helps answer that question. My own interests were early on in philosophy and literature. And so as a college student, I majored in philosophy and in English, which is to say in literature. And in the middle of this major, I came across writings by Edmund Husserl. Well, actually first Jean-Paul Sartre, This Being and Nothingness. And in it, I read about Martin Heidegger, and I got more interested in Heidegger than Sartre. And I found out about phenomenology, got very, very interested in Heidegger. In 1962, Sein und Zeit, Being and Time had been published, and I was a freshman in college 2 years later, so that 3 years later, 4 years later, I began to read this book. At the same time, I had a strong interest in psychoanalysis. And why? I thought perhaps I would like to work with people. And I had acquaintance of people who were from a purely psychological background, some who were from a medical background, who were psychiatrists. And mind you, I was quite young, but still I understood, I was trying to understand what these people did. And I found that very intriguing. To sit down with somebody and talk to them in a way that was meaningful to them was very intriguing. So I decided when I finished college and part of graduate school to become a psychoanalyst, which I did. And I did that here in New York, where I'm living. I've been for 45 years. And over a period of 5 years, experienced a training analysis in psychoanalysis, as well as attending classes, supervision, and all the rest over a period of 5 years. This was 600 hours for me, 600 hours, which was the minimum requirement for psychoanalysis. During this time, however, given what I had experienced earlier on and was swimming around in my head, the phenomenological, the Heideggerian, the hermeneutic, continued to mix in with this dogmatic Freudian psychoanalytic experience. And I realized that there was something missing. There was something wrong with it. And I couldn't say as an outsider that I disapproved of it. I could say that as an insider, I had found that it was unhelpful, inadequate. So I had learned what you're supposed to learn in a psychoanalysis, a training psychoanalysis, what it's like to be on the couch. There I lay for 600 hours over 5 years. And I realized that there was something missing. I knew by that time, of course, about Boss, about Heidegger, and his influence on him. And I decided that I needed to do this. And that's how I knew that I would become a Daseinanalyst, because the psychoanalytic experience, the psychoanalytic tradition I found was not answering to what I felt I could experience, and that I would want others to experience. My own Dasein analysis then lasted at least as long as the psychoanalysis, and by the beginning of the 1980s, the end of the 1980s, I was beginning to practice as a Dasein analyst. I will say mixed a little bit with traditional psychoanalytic kinds of psychotherapy, but gradually then left all of that behind and practiced only as Dasein analyst. So how do you know if you should become a Dasein analyst? If whatever you're doing is for you not satisfying, and if you feel that it is not true to what you understand about being human. All right, so the next question. What's the best background for one who wants to prepare as a Dasein analyst? I don't think there's one best background. And as I was putting these questions together the other day for Roberto for this, I was thinking about my own experience, of course, but also the experience of others that I have known. And here I think we have something again to learn from psychoanalysis. You may know that Freud was not a psychiatrist. Yep, you do know that. He was a neurologist. He never was a psychiatrist in a hospital. He was never trained as a psychiatrist. Psychoanalysis as psychotherapy is the invention of his own, as we know. He put neurology to one side and began something entirely new. He wrote in 1925 in his book, The Question of Lay Analysis, that is non-medical analysis. He went so far as to say, the background that I had as a medical doctor probably wasn't all that useful at all for me. And in fact, for some people, it might be a hindrance. And he wasn't quite clear about why, and Boss explained why. And that is, as a medical doctor, he, of course, was beholden to the natural science perspective. Doctors must, medical doctors must, right? You're dealing with that body, not the lived body, but the body. So at that time, then, people who became interested in psychoanalysis were psychiatrists. His favorite was, of course, Jung, who was a prominent psychiatrist and became a psychoanalyst thanks to Freud. But so also people from teaching, education, from law, and from the arts became interested in psychoanalysis. And my view is, and thinking about my own background, is that the broader, the more liberal the education of a person has been, speaks to the best background to prepare as a Dasein analyst. I would welcome, right? We would welcome people who come from a background in literature, let's say, or philosophy in particular. Some who have seen psychology as more than an experimental science. It's pretty difficult to do that at any university here in the United States or abroad, as far as I can tell. They are also candidates. They are also from a background that's useful. Freud also said, in answer to this question, how do you prepare as a psychoanalyst, right? Before he got around to talking about the preparation, the training, teaching, analysis, he said, wide reading in history and literature. Wide reading in history and literature. This has nothing to do with a technique. This has nothing to do with training, preparation courses. It has to do with what the Germans call Bildung, or your formation, the broadest base of your familiarity with especially literature, right? And especially the whole tradition of literature in as many languages translated or in the original as you can manage. lots and lots of poetry, and individuals coming from the fine arts as well. Why not, right? So that question then, what's the best background for one who wants to prepare as a Dasein analyst might be a little surprising. I'm not saying that a psychology PhD is the best place to start, right? Most of the individuals we see have an MD or a PsyD here in this country, or a PhD in clinical psychology, and from other places in the world as well. But the broad background that Freud talked about, and this interest in everything human, right? And from a multicultural perspective, to know as much about different cultures as possible, to know about indigenous traditions that are all to be found all over the world. These are very, very powerful sources of insight and understanding. And I think perhaps to read in other languages can be helpful, because, as you know, Portuguese, you can say things that you can't say in English, right? And vice versa. And so it is for French and German and Spanish and the rest. So wide reading and familiarity with other languages can be very, very helpful. Yeah. So that's the question, answered as best I can. What's the best background? And the next two questions are related, and I wonder if we should stop before we come to this pair and see if there are any comments or questions.
Yeah, Miles, I think that we can, pause on the question. I know that you are doing a great job by answering things, but I think that people might find more useful time to, just asking you directly something that they wanted to know.
Perfect. I'm ready for that.
Okay. So I'm going to stop sharing the screen. I don't know if any of you here have a question for Miles. I have a lot. Dalila, Bruno, nosso. Oh, okay. One of the questions that Pedro Desiderio have write down on the chat is related to Merleau-Ponty. Do you know Merleau-Ponty? Yeah.
I do indeed. In fact, that was my entrance into continental philosophy, the phenomenology of perception. It was a no book, and in the philosophy department where I was an undergraduate, and someone had the courage to devote a whole course to the phenomenology of perception. So that was my beginning, actually, in continental philosophy. Yeah.
Okay, beautiful. And Pedro Desiderio has a really specific interest in the Merleau-Ponty philosophy. As I mentioned to you on my email, I was presenting on the Congress, and he has presenting as well on a work that relates to Merleau-Ponty. And he's asking if Merleau-Ponty has some sort of impact on your daseinsanálise. I know that you are now mentioned that you have begun to read or buy Merleau-Ponty, but I don't know how Merleau-Ponty impacts on your way of daseinsanálise.
I can't say that it has had a direct impact on Dasein analysis. That is to say, if we were to look at the influence of the major work and the visible and the invisible side of the things that follow from Merleau-Ponty, they are occasionally referenced by Boss, by other Dasein analysts, but not extensively, Merleau-Ponty. But what I think is implicit, and I'm not sure, what Pedro and Desiderio and you talked about, but was the puzzle of perception when you come away from this book, and I'll just stick to this book as a major contribution, what you come away with, and I think that Boss, who was certainly familiar, and others, everyone in the tradition has read this book and is familiar with it, is that what Merleau-Ponty was trying to do in a phenomenology of perception, of wahrnehmen, of perceiving, was a challenge that eventually cannot be met. And because of the status of perception in our way of understanding the human experience. Because take this as an example, and then you can tell me if this is any part of what you were talking about in your presentation. We know that there's an outside world that can be measured, can be touched. We know how the sensory organs work, the eyes, the ears, the other senses, but particularly let's stick with the eyes, since they were so important to Merleau-Ponty, the visual. We know that once past the retina, there are no houses or cats or buildings or flowers, or there's electrical energy, there's electrochemical energy of a low voltage flowing through the brain. So the question is, how do we get from the outside world that my eyes are aimed at there to what we call the scene, right? There's the seeable and there's the seen. And it turns out, as Boss would say, to be unanswerable. It's a great mystery. And in fact, he took this from Heidegger in a number of places in the lecture courses. It's baffling. It's something that we simply don't understand. All we know is that there's a difference between the seeable and what we say we see. So my eyes don't see, I see, right? Now, how do we get from my eyes, which are part of the external world, to the I see, right? And yet remain in the same world in a Heideggerian sense. This is a great puzzle of perception. And I think reading this book of Merleau-Ponty with his, great knowledge of physiology and psychology of the 19th century and 20th century Gestalten, for example, and the particular French twist that he gives to it, right? Because you always have to keep in mind that if a German, for example, is looking at a problem and a Frenchman is looking at a problem, or I would say you could extend this to British and to very different ways of looking at things. There's a certain French twist that leads to Derrida and to Lacan and to very, very unique and curious and interesting, and for me very difficult to understand perspectives on things. But what Boss took away, I think, to go to Pedro's question, is the puzzle of perception, right? So a really honest and detailed phenomenology of perception ultimately leads you into a place of, an aporia, leads you to a place of, this is mysterious and can't be understood, right? How do you get from the so-called real world to the I? How do you get from the seeable to the I see, right? To the seer. Since while the eyes are important and sight, being able to see, are important, right? One born blind, for example, is still capable of seeing in this sense, you see. So that should be contradictory, right? Well, the person's eyes aren't working. How can this person see anything? And yet there are a couple of famous examples, including Helen Keller, but there are others of evidence, that this seeing of the seeable can happen, even if it's not using the eyes, which were meant to grasp the seeable world, but the fingertips are used to grasp the seeable world. She saw eventually. So I don't know, now you have to tell me what you two did in your presentation and whether this responds at all to that.
Sure, Miles. We didn't do a presentation together, but he was also on the Congress doing his own presentation. And I don't know, Pedro, if you want to add something to your question. Are comfortable in talking English directly to Miles? I'm not hearing you. No. No, not hearing. Why Pedro trying to okay, now you're listening.
Okay, you hear me? Okay, my presentation on the Congress, Roberto told you, was the contribution of the practice of Tai Chi, the martial art, and the experience of the students at the Tai Chi school. What's the phenomenon that occurred there, because we could experience the difference when they came and when they go. The difference of the perception, arriving at the school, talking to people inside the class, the movements of the body, the meditation, and it goes on and on. So my question was about the concept of the flesh. I don't know if in English is the same, of carne, in Portuguese, that Merleau-Ponty says.
Yes. I'm grasping, and I think Marcos came to this a bit earlier as well, what you're talking about. This notion of the flesh in Merleau-Ponty, which is somewhat later, as I think, than the phenomenology of perception, right? And this comes into his later writings. Yeah, well, I think where there is a common understanding between Daseinanalysis and this notion of the flesh in Merleau-Ponty is in the lived body, all right, the body that I am. So that that earlier distinction we were making between the body of skin and bones and muscles and fat and such, and the body that can be close or distant in a more primary way, right? That makes it possible for the actual physical body to be meaningful, is illustrated by this. And so I would say that there's a proximity, there's a close connection between this notion of the flesh in the later Merleau-Ponty and the lived body that we read about in Heidegger, but then also especially in Boss for Daseinanalysis. I don't know that the influence was direct. It may be one of those instances where in several places, something was being seen that hadn't been seen and taken into consideration seriously, that hadn't been taken into consideration before. Talking in the 50s and in the 60s, right, when this was being worked out. So I would say that the short answer, the easy answer, and I'd want to read your paper more carefully, would be this connection between the body as flesh versus the body as sinews and skin and bones and so on. So, and this would, I think, be nicely captured by Boss's notion of the lived body, the body I am, that the body that I am, not the body that I have. This seems to be what your Tai Chi individuals experienced, right? Was the lived body, and it changed. It changed as a result of their experience. Yeah, you didn't do anything to their bodies. You know, you didn't cut out any pieces or put anything on, or no, but they experienced it differently. They experienced their flesh differently.
Thank you.
Interesting. Yeah, thank you.
Then we can translate the paper,
Sure.
Pedro, and send to Miles afterwards. Miles, I have two questions. I know that we don't have much time.
Yeah, we have just a little 10 minutes or so. Yeah.
Yeah, you want to add something, or you want me to
No,
ask
let's
you?
take some questions. Yeah.
Yeah, there was one point, and that I don't know if I get correctly, but you mentioned that you were on in person on Zolicon seminars, and the other question that I have is, I know that you brought up the importance of the couch and on the Daseinanalysis, and I'm wondering if you see persons online and how you experience this, or you just offering in-person sessions.
So I was not at Zolicon seminars. They were over in 1969. I did meet Boss in 1976, in June 1976, where the Zolicon seminars had been held. So, and I met him for an hour, and we had a conversation. It was really terrific for me. But they were over by 69, and Heidegger died that year in May of 76. And I met Boss just 2 weeks after that. So the other question was about the couch, and just reframe what you said. You were asking.
I was wondering if you see persons online.
Yes. Okay. This is a very, 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 very issue, right? So we're experimenting in a few cases, in a few instances, with the possibility of virtual tele-Dasein-analysis, and the term almost scares me to hear, but so here are the problems, and here are the possibilities. The problems are that you're not in the presence of the other person in a shared environment, where all of the things that affect us are all around us. What you get in an interface like this, and I think that's the computer term, an interface, you don't get, I don't know your voice, Pedro, Desidero. I have a digitized version of your voice. I've never heard you speak, to be quite honest. I've heard a digitized voice. Yes. Now, I have met some people here face to face, and I know their voice directly and not digitized. Second, there are the colors. These are fake colors. This is not the skin, the hair, the eyes that you would see in person. These are digitized. These are artificially produced colors that replicate what you see in nature, so to speak, what you see when you see someone face to face. I don't know how tall Roberto is by comparison to me. For example, I've only seen people from the neck up or from about here up. You have no sense of the person, right? Even in a gross physical sense. So those are the problems, right? Oh yes, and the voice, finally, it's a digitized voice. I did say that. It's a digitized voice. And since that's so important to design analysis, I think it presents a problem. Well, then there are the possibilities. What if you take somebody who's far away and it can't be arranged otherwise? And second, you've met the person and spend some time with the person live and in analysis, properly speaking. Could we continue to do it virtually with the hope that there can be more opportunity to listen to this digitized, albeit digitized voice, and for the content and for the meaning and for in the service of Dasein analysis. It seems to me worth trying. At least if it's somebody that you've seen in the flesh, as it were. Yeah. And given the prospects of continuing what's been started properly, can we maybe overcome some of what's improper or misleading or false about this virtual virtuality? So let me just end on this. There's reality and there's virtuality. And until quite recently, human beings only knew reality, right? And I even met a woman years ago who was old, and she remembers the first time she listened to a phone voice. She was a little girl, and she was an old one. She was telling me this. And someone put the phone up to her ear to talk to her aunt in a different city in Italy. And she pushed the phone away, she told me, and looked all around the room for her aunt. I think that example is worth taking seriously, because this is to say virtual reality, I think is a misnomer. There isn't virtual reality. There's reality, and then there's virtuality, and we have to understand the difference between the two. So can there be Dasein analysis in virtuality? That's a question with some promise. That would in fact I don't even want to say replicate, but that would somehow make up for reality, right? So it's a question. It's an open question.
Okay, Miles, we are getting closer to the end of this webinar. I know that's all in virtual ways, it's all virtual, but I get the sense of connection, even if it's virtual, and I'm really grateful to have you here and to share your thoughts with Resilience. This is going to be uploaded to YouTube and subtitled in Portuguese, so more people can approach your work and what you are talking about. And yeah, there's a lot of questions yet, and we share your email to people who want to talk to you directly and know more about American Daseinsanalytic Institute. I know that you are very welcoming to these persons who are interested in. I don't know if you have anything to say at the end for us.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be able to see some faces here and see some names. and to have had some questions from Pedro and Marcos and the other both Pedros. I wish there had been more time for more responses. I guess there are some things in chat, but I haven't been looking in chat. It's enough just to manage to keep the computer working. So for me, technically, but I hope that you all will continue to ask these questions and think about them. And if there are any questions that are on the list that are pressing and of interest to you, by all means, write to me in an email letter. And thank you again, Roberto, and all of you for your attention this morning. And
Sure, it was great. Thank you, Chris, and also Pedro, to trying to be here today. He's a fellow from ADI program that I have the pleasure to see every Friday. And that's it for today webinar. And we can continue on our schedule. Okay. Bye-bye.
obrigado.